The drilling sound woke Ivy Hodge at 2:30 a.m. Persistent, mechanical, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She investigated, found nothing, went back to bed. 3 hours later, she struck a match in her kitchen on the 18th floor. The explosion was small. The collapse killed 5 people and changed construction codes across the entire world. The modern miracle of her new home gleamed around her, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames, central heating, an indoor bathroom, a fitted kitchen with gas appliances. After decades in Victorian terraced housing, this was luxury, progress, the future. 22 stories of prefabricated concrete panels bolted together like a giant's construction set, rising over East London. The building had opened just 2 months earlier, on March 11th. Fireproof, they'd promised. Built to last generations. Ivy struck a match to light her gas stove. The explosion wasn't massive, just a domestic gas leak, the kind that happens in homes every day. A small blast that should have blown out her windows, knocked her off her feet, left her with burns and a destroyed kitchen. The force threw her backward across the room, knocked her unconscious against the inner wall. Her kitchen walls disappeared. Then something impossible happened, something that would change building codes across the entire world. The entire southeast corner of Ronan Point ceased to exist. 22 floors. Gone. The 4 flats directly above Ivy's lost their support. Floor 19 collapsed onto floor 18, then floor 20, then 21, then 22. Each floor falling onto the one below in a cascading nightmare of concrete and steel. The weight was too much. The lower floors couldn't hold. The collapse propagated downward. Floor 17, 16, 15, all the way to the ground. Edward Latchford was walking along Butcher's Road when he heard it. Not an explosion, exactly. More like thunder made of concrete and screaming metal. As I was running away, he would later recall, I heard the building coming down with terrific cracks and bangs. A night watchman who'd just left his hut below the tower saw a puff of smoke, then heard an enormous crash. He looked up. One entire corner of the building had vanished. Where there had been living rooms and kitchens stacked 22 stories high, there was now only morning sky and a cliff of exposed bedrooms. Inside the tower, 260 residents were waking to hell. Brenda Morn, on the 13th floor, had been sleeping on her living room sofa. The walls around her simply disappeared. She opened her eyes to find herself on a narrow ledge. 3 of her flat's 4 walls gone. Nothing between her and a 100-foot drop but air. She clung to the doorframe, watching as furniture, walls, and entire sections of her neighbors' homes rained down into the rubble below. A broken tibia, a dislocated shoulder, 3 broken teeth. She stood on that ledge, holding on as the building stopped falling around her. 4 people were dead. Thomas and Pauline Murrell, who lived in flat 110 on the 22nd floor, the top of the building. They'd refused their allocated flat 8 times, ultimately agreeing to live there only because their former home had been condemned. They died in their bed as their entire flat dropped 22 stories. Thomas McCluskey and Edith Bridgestoke, who lived in flat 85 on the 17th floor, were crushed beneath falling concrete. A fifth victim, Anne Carter, would die later in the hospital. 17 others were injured. The death toll should have been catastrophic. 50, 70, 100. But the explosion happened at 5:45 in the morning, when most residents were still in their bedrooms. The collapse sheared off only the living room side of the apartments. The bedrooms, on the other side of each flat, remained largely intact except on floors 17 through 22. People woke to find half their homes simply gone, their beds positioned at the edge of a cliff. And Ivy Hodge, in whose kitchen the gas had exploded, she survived, knocked unconscious by the blast, protected by the inner walls of her kitchen that somehow remained standing. When rescue workers found her, she was dazed, suffering from minor shock and burns, but alive. The explosion that destroyed an entire corner of a tower block barely injured the woman at its center. What investigators would discover in the days, months, and years that followed would be far more terrifying than the collapse itself. The inquiry began immediately. Her Majesty's government, panicking, appointed Hugh Griffiths to lead the investigation. Anthony Greenwood, the Minister for Housing, directed his aides the day after the collapse with a chilling instruction. The inquiry's terms of reference should be carefully considered to ensure that they implied no blame on the part of the local authority. The Ministry of Housing and Local Government continued approving identical prefabricated panel schemes to prevent unnecessary alarm among people occupying flats built in this way, while accepting that they would incur the risk of another similar accident. 10 Downing Street was nervous. Prime Minister Harold Wilson and Richard Crossman, leader of the House of Commons, had confidential discussions about embarrassing issues that could make the inquiry's report unpleasant for the government. They had reason to worry. What the inquiry would reveal was a scandal of negligence, corner-cutting, and systemic failure that extended from the construction site all the way to the highest levels of British government. The gas leak was traced quickly, a cracked nut connecting the building's gas line to Ivy Hodge's stove. The nut had been over-tightened during installation, causing it to crack. Gas had been leaking into her flat overnight. That's what she'd heard at 2:30 a.m., that persistent drilling sound, gas hissing through a crack, filling her hallway, seeping into her kitchen. By 5:45, the concentration was deadly. One match, one spark. But the explosion itself was small. Investigators measured the blast pressure at just 3 pounds per square inch. Enough to knock out a kitchen wall, certainly. Enough to blow out windows. But not enough to destroy an entire corner of a 22-story building. Not even close. A properly designed structure should have absorbed that blast without catastrophic failure. At most, Ivy's flat should have been damaged. Maybe the flat directly above. The building should have stood. The Building Research Station and Imperial College of London performed an extensive battery of tests. The results were damning. The walls could have been displaced by a pressure of only 2.8 pounds per square inch. The kitchen and living room walls moved at just 0.25 pounds per square inch. 0.25. A stiff breeze generates more force. The structure was held together by gravity and hope. Ronan Point was built using the Larsen-Nielsen large panel system, a Danish construction method developed in 1948. Factory-built, precast concrete panels designed to minimize on-site construction work. Walls, floors, and stairways all precast. The panels were lifted into place, one story at a time, and bolted together. Quick, cheap, efficient. There was only one problem. The system was designed for buildings no taller than 6 stories. Ronan Point was 22. Taylor Woodrow, Anglian, the construction company, had taken a system meant for low-rise buildings and extended it into the sky. The panels were joined together with mechanical connections, primarily bolts, supplemented with a dry-pack mortar that was supposed to secure the connection. But there was no structural frame, no redundancy, no alternative load paths. If one panel failed, the panels above lost their support. The entire system relied on each panel bearing the weight of everything above it, transferred through friction and gravity alone. When Ivy's kitchen wall blew out, the 4 flats above lost their load-bearing support. They fell. Their weight crashed onto floor 17. Floor 17, designed to support only its own load, plus normal occupancy, suddenly had 5 entire floors land on top of it. It collapsed instantly. The progressive collapse had begun, each floor pancaking onto the one below. 22 floors of concrete falling like a house of cards. In the immediate aftermath, Taylor Woodrow Anglian's managing director issued a statement. The collapse, he insisted, was not related to a failure of the building itself. It was an unfortunate accident, an explosion. Nothing to do with the structure. The building had been perfectly sound. He was lying. Or perhaps he genuinely didn't know, but the truth would come out. The inquiry's initial findings were released within months. Ronan Point and buildings like it were vulnerable to progressive collapse from not just explosions, but from high winds, fires, or even structural movement from thermal expansion. The building was designed to withstand wind velocities of only 100 kilometers per hour, 63 miles per hour. But winds of 170 kilometers per hour, 105 miles per hour, could be expected to occur at 200 feet above the ground every 60 years, well within the building's expected lifespan. A strong storm could have brought it down. Fire could have destroyed it too. The inquiry estimated that fire could expand and arch the floor slabs, bending the wall panels enough to displace or rotate the joints to a dangerous degree. A serious apartment fire could have triggered the same progressive collapse that the gas explosion caused. The building codes used for Ronan Point's design had been issued in 1952. 16 years old. Outdated. The National Physical Laboratory had published data in 1963 showing that higher winds than the code specified were known to occur. Nobody had updated the regulations. Nobody had stopped construction. Ronan Point had been a disaster waiting to happen. The gas explosion just happened to be the trigger. But the inquiry's recommendations, while significant, barely scratched the surface of the real horror. Because what happened next revealed that the problem wasn't just design, it was construction. And the construction was criminally incompetent. The government ordered Ronan Point reinforced and partially rebuilt. Gas was banned from the building, all gas lines disconnected, all stoves replaced with electric models. The southeast corner was reconstructed as a separate section and joined to the existing building with walkways. blast angles were installed to provide additional structural support. Engineers assured residents and the public that the building was now safe. The regulations had been updated. The Fifth Amendment to the building regulations came into force in 1970, requiring that buildings be constructed so that, in the event of an accident, the building will not suffer collapse to an extent disproportionate to the cause. All new buildings over 5 stories had to be able to resist an explosive force of 4.9 pounds per square inch. Problem solved. Ronan Point reopened. Tenants moved back in. Life continued. But one man wasn't convinced. Sam Webb, an architect who had given evidence to the Griffiths inquiry, made a prediction. After approximately 15 years, he told anyone who would listen, Ronan Point would develop serious structural problems. In conversations with tenants, he described what would happen. There would be gaps between walls and floors through which smoke would pass. You'd be able to hear people and their televisions on different floors. The building would slowly tear itself apart. Nobody in government wanted to hear it. Ronan Point had been fixed, reinforced. The inquiry was closed, the regulations updated. Admitting that the building was still dangerous would mean admitting that hundreds of identical buildings across Britain were also dangerous. It would mean evacuating thousands of families, demolishing millions of pounds worth of public housing. Political suicide. So nothing was done. For 18 years, people lived in Ronan Point, raised children there, celebrated birthdays and holidays, went to sleep every night in a building that could collapse at any moment. Then, in 1986, the Newham Tower Blocks campaign, advised by Sam Webb, forced the council's hand. They demanded structural investigations. The council, under immense public pressure, finally agreed. Engineers were brought in to examine Ronan Point and its 8 twin towers on the Freemasons' estate. What they found exceeded even Webb's darkest predictions. The reinforcements installed after the collapse, inadequate. The building still couldn't withstand the required 2.5 pounds per square inch of pressure mandated by law. A moderate gas explosion, high wind, or serious fire could still bring it down. But that was just the beginning. Newham Council made a decision. They would give the building research establishment permission to test Ronan Point to destruction. The building was evacuated. Then the engineers went to work. Floor by floor, panel by panel, they examined the structure that had housed families for 18 years. The building failed its fire test within 11 minutes. The fire spread rapidly. The flats could not contain a fire for 1 hour as required by law. Ronan Point had been illegally occupied for 18 years. Then the engineers opened up the load-bearing joints between the concrete panels, the joints that held the building together, the joints that were supposed to be filled with solid concrete and secured with properly torqued bolts. They found old tin cans. They found screwed-up newspaper. They found gaps, voids, air pockets where concrete should have been, bolts that weren't properly tightened, bolts that were missing entirely. The building had been assembled by unskilled labourers who either didn't know or didn't care that lives depended on their work. The construction was so shoddy, so negligent, that the real mystery wasn't why Ronan Point partially collapsed in 1968. The mystery was why it hadn't fallen down sooner, why it had stood at all. Every single day for 18 years, 260 families had been sleeping, eating, and living in a structure that was one strong gust of wind away from total collapse. Sam Webb had been right. The government had known. The council had known. Taylor, Woodrow Anglian, had almost certainly known. And they'd said nothing. Done nothing. Because admitting the truth would have been too expensive, too embarrassing, too politically damaging. In 1986, Ronan Point and all 8 of its twin towers on the Freemasons' estate were demolished, replaced with sensible, low-rise terraced housing, the kind of housing the residents had left behind when they'd moved into their luxury tower block 18 years earlier. But the impact of Ronan Point extended far beyond East London. The disaster had shaken the world. In 1970, the Fifth Amendment to the UK Building Regulations introduced the concept of disproportionate collapse prevention. Buildings must be designed so that a localized failure doesn't trigger total collapse. The principle of structural redundancy, alternative load paths, and robust connections became mandatory. The gas industry was fundamentally reformed. Public confidence in gas had been shattered. Virtually no high-rise blocks were built with gas after Ronan Point. High-rises became fully electric. In 1970, British Gas formed Corgi, the Council for Registered Gas Installers, a voluntary body that would eventually become mandatory. In 1972, the first ever gas safety installation and use regulations came into force. Today's Gas Safe Register, the mandatory registration body for all gas engineers in the UK, stems directly from Ivy Hodge's exploding kitchen. The United States amended its building codes. Canada followed. Australia, New Zealand. Countries around the world looked at the photographs of Ronan Point's sheared-off corner and rewrote their regulations. The disaster that killed 5 people in Canning Town changed construction standards globally. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Public confidence in high-rise residential buildings was irreparably shaken. The towers that had represented progress, modernity, and the future suddenly looked like death traps. The homes in the sky became concrete prisons. The rate of tower block construction in Britain plummeted. The towers that were built incorporated expensive structural redundancy, driving up costs and making the economics less attractive. The modernist dream of Le Corbusier's radiant city, of efficiently stacking families vertically to save ground space and create density, died in the rubble beneath Ronan Point. The human stories haunted Britain for decades. Thomas and Pauline Murrell, who'd refused that top-floor flat 8 times, who'd only agreed because their old home was condemned. They'd moved in weeks earlier. Now they were dead. Brenda Morn, clinging to a door frame on the 13th floor, her living room vanished, her neighbours' possessions raining past her into the debris below. Ivy Hodge herself, who walked away from an explosion that destroyed an entire corner of a building, who survived with minor burns while 5 others died. Ivy took her gas stove with her to her new flat. The same stove that had leaked, the same stove that had exploded. By all reports, she continued using it for years. Whether this represented remarkable courage or severe trauma response, nobody could say. The inquiry had given evidence that painted a devastating picture of the construction industry in Britain. Skilled construction labourers were becoming scarce in the 1960s. They'd found safer, easier jobs in factories. The tower blocks were being built by unskilled workers, many of whom couldn't read the plans, didn't understand the engineering, and had never built anything taller than 2 stories. They were given prefabricated panels, bolts, and dry pack mortar, and told to stack them into the sky. Quality control was minimal. Supervision was inadequate. The Larsen-Nielsen system was brilliant in theory. Fast construction, low cost, standardized components. Perfect for post-war Britain, which needed to replace hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed by German bombing and clear thousands more Victorian slums that were centuries overdue for demolition. But theory doesn't account for newspapers stuffed into load-bearing joints. Theory doesn't account for missing bolts. Theory doesn't account for over-tightened gas fittings that crack and leak. Theory doesn't account for human error, incompetence, and negligence. And theory doesn't comfort the families who lost loved ones because a building that was supposed to be fireproof, safe, and modern turned out to be a house of cards held together with gravity. In the decades since, Ronan Point has become synonymous with construction failure. Engineering students study it, architects reference it, building inspectors cite it. The disaster appears in textbooks, documentaries, and disaster case studies. In the decade after the collapse, over 300 engineering articles and reports were published on progressive collapse and structural robustness. European countries and Canada adopted new standards. Research into disproportionate collapse became a major field of study. But then, as memories faded and new generations of engineers graduated without having lived through the shock, research stalled. The lessons seemed learned. The codes seemed adequate. Nobody wanted to dwell on a 50-year-old disaster. Until Grenfell Tower. On June 14th, 2017, a fire broke out in a 24-story tower block in West London. The building, designed in 1967 and completed in 1974, was robustly constructed with a concrete frame. It didn't collapse, but it didn't need to. The fire, fueled by flammable cladding installed during a recent refurbishment, spread up the exterior in minutes. 72 people died. The worst residential fire in Britain since the Second World War. Grenfell Tower had been built with the lessons of Ronan Point in mind. Its structure was sound. It could withstand fire, wind, and explosions. But the refurbishment, completed just months before the fire, had wrapped the building in combustible materials. The regulations had focused so intensely on structural integrity, on preventing progressive collapse, that they'd failed to adequately address fire safety in refurbishments. The parallels to Ronan Point were impossible to ignore. A government that prioritized cost over safety. Regulations that lagged behind technology. Residents whose concerns were dismissed. A disaster that killed dozens and changed laws. And most chillingly, the discovery that hundreds of similar buildings across Britain faced the same risks. After Grenfell, John Napton, Emeritus Professor of Structural Engineering at Newcastle University, noted that regulations that came into force in 1971 following Ronan Point had improved building structural strength in such a way as to prevent the collapse of Grenfell Tower. The building stood. The structure held. But 72 people still died. Ronan Point taught Britain that buildings must not collapse disproportionately. Grenfell taught Britain that structural integrity alone isn't enough. Both lessons came written in blood. Today, the site where Ronan Point stood is occupied by low-rise terraced housing, sensible, traditional. The kind of housing that had stood in London for centuries without collapsing. There's no memorial to the 5 people who died. though some have called for one. No plaque commemorating the disaster that changed construction worldwide. Just houses. Normal or boring, safe houses. But the legacy lives on in every building code, every structural redundancy calculation, every gas safety inspection, every engineer who designs with robustness in mind. Ronan Point is the disaster that's never mentioned by name, but influences every decision, the ghost that haunts every tall building. The collapse raised questions that Britain is still grappling with today. How do you balance the urgent need for housing with safety? How do you regulate construction without stifling development? How do you ensure that cost-cutting doesn't compromise integrity? Who's responsible when a building fails? The designers, the builders, the regulators, the politicians who pushed for faster, cheaper construction. In 1968, Britain needed housing desperately. London was still recovering from the Blitz. Victorian slums needed clearing. Thousands of families lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The tower blocks seemed like the answer. Modern, efficient, quick to build. Newham had built almost 15,000 new homes by 1968, a post-war record for a London borough, but there were still 9,000 slums to be cleared. The pressure was immense, so corners were cut, regulations weren't updated, unskilled workers assembled complex structures. Systems designed for 6 stories were extended to 22. Warning signs were ignored, and when Sam Webb predicted disaster, he was dismissed as alarmist. Ivy Hodge wanted a cup of tea. That's all. A simple morning routine. Strike a match, light the stove, boil water, the kind of thing millions of people do every day without incident. But because a nut was over-tightened during installation, because newspapers were stuffed into load-bearing joints, because a building system was extended beyond its design limits, because regulations were outdated, because nobody wanted to admit the truth, that cup of tea cost 5 lives and changed the world. The explosion lasted less than a second. The collapse took perhaps 20 or 30 seconds, though nobody timed it precisely. But the impact has lasted 57 years and counting. Ivy Hodge lived for years after the collapse. She rarely spoke publicly about it. What could she say? She'd survived through pure luck, through the accident of being thrown in the right direction, through the capricious physics of blast waves. She'd woken early. She'd heard that drilling sound at 2:30 a.m. She'd investigated and found nothing. She'd gone back to bed. 3 hours later, she'd wanted tea. 5 people died because she wanted tea. That's not fair, of course. She didn't kill anyone. The negligence killed them. The corner cutting killed them. The system that prioritized speed and cost over safety killed them. But Ivy still struck the match. She still lived while others died. That kind of survivor's guilt doesn't fade. The gas leak had been hissing for at least 3 hours, possibly longer. If Ivy had stayed awake at 2:30, if she'd investigated more thoroughly, if she'd smelled the gas, if she'd called someone, if the building had been properly constructed, if the regulations had been adequate, if the workers had done their jobs correctly, if the government had listened to warnings, if. But history isn't written in ifs. It's written in what actually happened. And what happened was that a 56-year-old cake decorator struck a match in her kitchen on the 18th floor of a tower block in East London. And the entire world learned that progress isn't always progress, that modern isn't always safe, that the future isn't always better than the past. They said it was fireproof. They said it was safe. They said it would last generations. They said it represented the future of housing. They were wrong about all of it. And when Ivy Hodge struck that match at 5:45 on the morning of May 16th, 1968. 8. The future of housing died with Thomas Murrell, Pauline Murrell, Thomas McCluskey, Edith Bridgestook, and Anne Carter. The tower blocks continued to rise for a few more years, because changing course is like turning a tanker. But the trajectory had changed. The confidence was shattered. The dream was dead. Ronan Point killed it. Today, when engineers design tall buildings, they calculate for progressive collapse. They design redundancy. They create alternative load paths. They ensure that the failure of one element doesn't trigger total failure. It's called robustness, and it exists because of what happened in Canning Town in 1968. When gas engineers install appliances, they follow strict regulations. They torque bolts to precise specifications. They test for leaks. They're licensed, trained, and inspected. The entire regulatory framework exists because a cracked nut leaked gas into Ivy Hodge's flat. When building inspectors examine construction, they look for newspapers stuffed into joints. They check connections. They verify that structural elements are actually structural. The entire concept of construction quality, control in its modern form, stems from what was found when Ronan Point was disassembled. The disaster taught the world that you can't bolt together prefabricated panels without understanding structural engineering. That you can't extend a system beyond its design limits without consequences. That you can't prioritize cost and speed over safety. That you can't ignore warnings. That you can't hide problems and hope they go away. These seem like obvious lessons now. But they weren't obvious in 1968. Or perhaps they were obvious, and people just chose to ignore them because the alternative was expensive and politically difficult. Ronan Point collapsed because of a perfect storm of failures. Design failure, construction failure, regulatory failure, political failure, human failure. Remove any single element from that chain and the disaster might have been prevented. Tighten that nut correctly and there's no gas leak. Update the building codes and the system isn't approved. Supervise the construction properly and the joints aren't filled with trash. Listen to the engineers who warned about progressive collapse and the design is strengthened. But every failure in that chain happened. Every warning was ignored. Every corner was cut. Every shortcut was taken, and 5 people died. The question that haunts engineers and regulators to this day is simple. What are we ignoring now? What corners are we cutting? What warnings are we dismissing? What's the next Ronan Point? Because there's always a next one. Grenfell proved that. Somewhere, right now, there's a building with a fatal flaw, a design error, a construction defect, a material that shouldn't have been used, a regulation that's outdated, a warning that's being ignored. And somewhere, someone is going to strike a match, or light a cigarette, or plug in a heater, or just go about their normal daily routine. And that fatal flaw will be exposed. People will die. Inquiries will be held. Reports will be written. regulations will be updated, and engineers will add another case study to the textbooks. That's the cycle. That's the cost of progress. We learn from disasters because humans are remarkably good at ignoring warnings until something terrible happens. We're reactive, not proactive. We wait for the building to collapse before we strengthen the design. Ronan Point should have been a wake-up call that changed everything immediately. Instead, it took 18 more years before the building was properly examined. 18 years of families living in danger. And even then, it took activists and journalists forcing the issue before the government acted. The system is designed to protect itself, not the people living in the buildings. That's the real lesson of Ronan Point. Not that buildings can collapse. Engineers knew that. But that the political and economic incentives prioritize covering up problems over fixing them. That admitting a mistake is harder than risking lives. That the cheapest solution in the short term is often the most expensive in the long term when measured in human cost. Ivy Hodge just wanted a cup of tea. And the world learned that 5 lives is apparently the price of learning. What happens when you build tower blocks with newspapers stuffed in the joints? The next time you see a tall building, think about Ronan Point. Think about the calculations that went into ensuring it won't collapse if one element fails. Think about the gas safety regulations that govern every appliance. Think about the inspections, the certifications, the training, the oversight. All of it exists because a 56-year-old cake decorator struck a match in Canning Town in 1968. They said it was fireproof. They were wrong.